Hey guys, we're going to be talking about the SansAmp RPM, the rack mountable unit from Tech 21. Now I'm going to be doing this video in a few different segments, so if you want to just hear what this thing sounds like, click the link in the description or click anywhere in the video that I designate, because that will be that. This is going to be an overview and review of the RPM as well as that versus the RBI. So if you guys want that information, stay tuned. Now, of course, Tech 21 has been making these preamps for a very long time now, and bass players have been using them for a very long time. They're very popular. The SansAmp bass driver has been a part of my rig for a few years now. I absolutely love it. If you guys have watched my channel for a while, you guys know that I love that thing. I can't live without it. I plug into it whether I'm running into an amp, whether I'm running into a mixing console or an interface. I love the tonal capabilities and the emulation on the actual device. Now, because I loved the bass driver so much, I wanted to get a rack mountable version, which is the RBI, the SansAmp RBI, which is the rack mountable version of the SansAmp bass driver, the floor model. I wanted to get that and put that on top of my amp, put it so that I wouldn't have to essentially have it on my pedal board, so that I could just kind of rip it out and have that space free. But as I was searching, I ran into the Paradriver, the other SansAmp floor model that kind of looks like the SansAmp bass driver, but has a few different features on it. The rack mountable version of that was the SansAmp RPM. So the SansAmp bass driver has a rack mountable version called the RBI, and the SansAmp Paradriver has a rack mountable version called the RPM. And instead of having two of the same thing and then rendering my floor model sort of useless, I decided to go with the RPM. I decided to go with the Paradriver, the other model, so that I would have both. Further in my research, I found out that bass players use either the RPM or the RBI, or both, in their rigs to get the best of both worlds and essentially have the RBI as their main preamp and then get the mid-frequency control that you get from the RPM. Some bass players actually go as far as pairing two of these together with a power amp and making that their main amplifier. So instead of replacing my floor model bass driver with a rack mountable RBI, I decided to get an RPM and actually run it together with my floor model to get really awesome tonal configurations. Now, when looking at the RPM and the RBI and the Paradriver and the bass driver, it can be slightly confusing. So, to make it simple, the basic difference between the two, between the bass driver and the Paradriver, or the RBI and the RPM, is the presence control and the mid control on either of the units. So you've got the presence control on the bass driver, or the RBI, and then you've got a mid-shift control on the Paradriver, or the RPM. Also, the RBI and the bass driver are marketed solely for bass guitar, or more for bass guitar, because the frequencies are more used for bass guitar, while the Paradriver and the RPM are marketed for acoustic guitars, electric guitars, as well as bass guitar. All the other features, be it the bass control, the drive control, the treble control, and the blend, are similar and the same throughout both units. The RPM is also tuned for more frequencies than just more of the bass frequencies, so you are able to use it with acoustic guitar or electric guitar as well as the bass guitar. Why would you want to have mid-frequency control? The mid-range can make or break your bass tone. It's essentially the hidden enemy when it comes to EQing a bass guitar. A lot of people think that adding too much bass or taking too much bass out is usually the worst thing a bass player can do, but that's not actually it. When you don't have the right mid-range, meaning if you crank it too much, or if you take out and scoop too much of the mid-range, or if you just do the wrong thing, sometimes your bass will not sound as good as maybe when it does in your room or somewhere else. So for example, let's say that you have your mids set to a certain way when you're playing using your fingers. And let's say 90% of the time you do use your fingers, so it's fine, you know, scooping the mids or increasing them is usually fine. But let's say you move to a piece where you're starting to do some slap pop, or you're going to something where you're using a pick or something else, anything where you're adding some overdrive. A lot of times the mid-range is going to act a little weird because of that different dynamic that you're using, and sometimes it's not going to sound as good as you're playing it. So you'll end up dialing the mid frequencies back a little bit, or you'll end up adding some mid frequencies, or whatever you have to do to compensate for whatever tonal differences that you're making. It is something that is nice to have control over when you are adding a lot of different types of overdrive, or when you're playing in different styles and variations and tunings and things like that, where the mid-range is going to be moving around a little bit more than where you have your bass or treble set. So if this is your first preamp and you're kind of in the market in the beginning, and you're between the RBI and the RPM, or the floor model bass driver or the para driver, I would recommend actually either getting the RBI or the bass floor model first, because as a bass player, those are going to be the strongest units. Those are going to be the most versatile. I still find a lot more use out of my SansAmp bass driver than I do from my RPM. Not that the RPM doesn't sound that great, it's that my needs are well met, more than well met, by my bass driver that are only complemented by the RPM. Of course, the RPM and the para driver, those are more versatile. They're made for acoustic guitar, and they're made for electric guitar as well as bass. They, of course, compensate less for just bass guitar. So if you're going for just one unit by itself, I would definitely recommend one of those two versus the RPM or the para driver. If you do already have a SansAmp RBI or a SansAmp bass driver, then I definitely recommend trying it in pair with an RPM or a para driver, because that is a really versatile tonal configuration. You can do almost anything on there. You get your presence and your top end, as well as all, most of your bass controls with the bass driver or the RBI, and then you've got the mid-range control and some extra drive or bass or treble right over on the RPM. So that's a very monstrous professional setup if you have both of those together. I am going to say now that Tech 21 is not paying me to say this. I am honestly telling you how I feel about their products, so do not think that. In fact, I don't even know if they're watching this video. So I do genuinely love their products. I genuinely love the way they sound, and I wanted to add another SansAmp into my rig, and this was the perfect addition. So I'm going to be reviewing this as a bassist, not an acoustic guitar player or an electric guitar player, even though I do dabble. By itself, the RPM emphasizes mid-range. And the mid-range, of course, can make or break a bass tone. With too much mid-range, you can risk sounding muddy and overpower the bass and treble. And with too little mid-range, you might lack body in your tone, and you might not be able to do what the bass guitar's job is. If you're running right into your amp for a clean tone, and you're looking for a unit that is mostly for overdrive as well as the other things that a DI can do, I actually recommend the bass driver or the RBI, because the drive control on there is a little bit more tuned to bass frequencies, so boosting it isn't going to be more overpowering like it is on the RPM. When I boost the drive, I end up having to cut mid-range. I end up having to turn the bass down a little bit because the drive does end up overpowering some of the frequencies that I need it to not overpower. But that is because of the very nature of the unit. The drive control paired with the bass driver together, though, is a whole different story. I love adding the drive of the RPM and then dialing it back on the bass driver to get some really good quality drive out of the RPM unit. If you already have an RBI or a bass driver DI, this is going to be the perfect addition. It gives you tonal control over a huge parameter in a similar configuration. For a lot of bass players, the RPM and the RBI is paired together with a power amp as their main amp, and these are professional touring musicians which are using this as not only their live sound, but their tone when they're recording, their tone when they're running into a mixing board for any kind of talk show situation or anything like that. So that has got to speak wonders for something like this. So if you're a bass player alone, then I definitely would check out the RPM as well as the RBI and the bass driver. I would, of course, check out the RBI or the bass driver first. If you are a studio musician, or if you're just somebody who records bands and you're thinking about getting a SansAmp for bass guitar, but you also want something for acoustic guitar, just something more versatile, I would actually take a look at the RPM. It is more than enough for bass guitar by itself when you're recording in a studio. So if you just want a great bass tone for your bass players, then the RPM would work just fine, because it does give you the drive control, it does give you bass, does give you treble, it gives you all of that. And then of course in post-production you can change and add anything you want, as well as being able to record some acoustic guitar and electric guitar and other things through the same device. So you kind of get more out of what you would normally use for just bass guitar. For bass players, I definitely would recommend having both of them together. It is a fierce tone. I will be doing a video for that alone. I'm going to be doing one where I pair both of them together. You'll hear one by itself, the other by itself, and then how they sound together, how they complement each other, how they work off of each other. That's going to be in the future. If you guys have any questions about the SansAmp, if you guys have any other questions, ask down below, ask on Twitter, ask on Facebook. Check out my FAQ Fridays, which I have most of the time on Fridays. And check out my Cyrus Manson channel. It's actually my comedy YouTube channel, or my vlog YouTube channel. Keep you entertained while I come out with some more of these. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one.